This is Sky News Breakfast, live from Downing Street, home to Liz Truss for just a few more days after 6 turbulent weeks as Prime Minister. But who will move in next? And is Boris Johnson really kicking the sand off his sandals in the Caribbean, ready for a new run at the top job? We'll hear from his former right-hand man, Will Walden, from senior Tory MPs Crispin Blunt and Sir Christopher Chope, Labour's Rachel Reeves and the Lib Dem leader, Ed Davey. It's Friday, the 21st of October. The race is on. Liz Truss's departure means there'll be a new Prime Minister exactly a week today at the latest. Out of the shadows, Boris Johnson is expected to return early from his Caribbean holiday, with supporters calling for a comeback.
He's a known winner, and that's certainly who I'll be putting my name against, because I want us to win the next election.
I would just urge colleagues who may be thinking of throwing their hat into the ring, just take stock, put the country before their own personal ambition.
It's threatening to be a crowded field to replace Britain's shortest-serving Prime Minister, but there's only room for 3 when the counting starts. Opposition parties call for an end to the upheaval and demand a general election. Also ahead, gridlocked, the damning report showing patients unable to leave hospital and a health and care system seizing up. Hello and a very good morning from Downing Street. The morning after a dramatic day, culminating in Liz Truss's resignation here yesterday afternoon. After 6 turbulent weeks, the race to be the next Prime Minister is already shaping up to be remarkable. Boris Johnson is said to be sounding out his supporters to see if he's got enough votes to beat Rishi Sunak, the man who quit as his Chancellor. And far from healing the party rifts, some backbenchers are threatening to resign their seats if Mr Johnson makes a comeback. So let's take a look then at those who are in contention. Well, currently, Rishi Sunak is the bookmakers' favourite to take over and also has the highest number of MPs publicly backing him. 33 have come out in support so far. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson follows closely behind in MP support with 27. And in third is the Commons leader, Penny Mordaunt. 12 MPs have said that they'll back her. Then the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. Then the Trade Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, could also be in the running, along with Suella Braverman, who resigned just days ago as Home Secretary. Amanda Akas has our first report.
After Liz Truss's calamitous 44 days in power, the race is on to find her replacement. The party have vowed to choose the new occupant of 10 Downing Street by Friday in a bid to rebuild after the shortest term of any British Prime Minister in history.
I recognise, though, given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
Supporters of Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt are already out on manoeuvres.
In these times when we're facing now, we've got horrific problems in the global financial markets, and we need somebody who's got the experience to deliver real stability over the next few years.
Hope that she does stand. I backed her back in the summer when there was the leadership election after Boris had resigned, and I hope she puts herself forward again. I'll certainly enthusiastically back her.
But in an extraordinary twist, some MPs are hoping Liz Truss's downfall could pave a way back for the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. He's said to be cutting short his Caribbean holiday to sound out his supporters.
He's a known winner, and that's certainly who I'll be putting my name against, because I want us to win the next election. And it's time for some stability and some unity. And I think in order to achieve that, we need to put in place, I believe, the person who has the mandate of the British people.
Others in the party are calling for restraint.
I would just urge colleagues who may be thinking of throwing their hat into the ring, just take stock, put the country before their own personal ambition, and let's try and get on and, dig us out of the hole we've actually put the country into and also ourselves into as well.
Labour want another general election.
So you've got this real choice, utter chaos with the Conservatives or stability under a Labour government. So the risk is not a general election. The risk is carrying on with this utter chaos.
For voters living in Liz Truss's Norfolk constituency, it's been exhausting.
It's like a children's playground, really. Unbelievable.
I think the Conservative Party will be destroying themselves. They are slowly destroying themselves. They've really got to sort it out.
Last night, the ultimate humiliation. The lettuce, which the Daily Star bet would outlast Liz Truss's premiership, beamed onto the walls of Parliament. Whoever wins the contest to succeed her has an uphill struggle ahead. Amanda Akas, Sky News.
Well, Liz Truss entered number 10 after a leadership campaign that lasted 8 weeks. She finally became Prime Minister after 81,000 Conservative Party members voted for her. This time around, that process will last just 1 week, and it could be over even sooner than that. Well, nominations are open now, and they're going to close at 2 p.m. on Monday. Candidates must secure 100 nominations from MPs to get through. If only one contender reaches that mark, they'll be elected Prime Minister on Monday. Well, assuming at least 2 make it through, MPs will vote between 3:30 and 5:30 on Monday. If there are 3, the person with the fewest votes will be eliminated. Well, the remaining 2 candidates will then face televised hustings. And the final choice will be made by Conservative Party members in an online vote, which closes at 11 a.m. next Friday, the 28th of October. And the result will then be announced by that evening at the latest. Well, our political correspondent, Rob Powell, is here with me this morning. Morning to you, Rob. An incredible day in politics once again yesterday, and we find ourselves in this extraordinary position of facing another leadership battle for the top of the Tory party and the Prime Minister.
Yeah, an incredible week, really. It was this time last week that Kwasi Kwarteng was still Chancellor, was flying back from Washington, where he'd just given an interview assuring everyone that both he and the Prime Minister would still be in post in a month's time, a week on, and they are both gone. Liz Truss, the shortest serving Prime Minister ever, probably will go down as one of the least successful Prime Ministers ever as well, really having the indignity of watching all of her policies that she set out over the summer being stripped away in the final days of her premiership. In terms of what happens now, as you say, we are obviously into another race to find another Prime Minister and Conservative leader. But the crucial difference in this race is how short it is, and crucially, that they need 100 nominations to get onto that ballot initially. Now, that was 20 in the last leadership race, and what that means is there will be far fewer people who realistically make it to the MP's ballot, and it may well be that it doesn't even make it to a ballot or a member's ballot as well. And what it essentially means is that there are probably only 3 people really in contention, and those names are probably Rishi Sunak, Penny Mordaunt, and Boris Johnson.
Well, yes, and some people might be surprised that his name is being put forward potentially. How likely is a comeback by the former Prime Minister?
I'm told by one of his friends this morning that it's likely that he's up for it. Now, despite the Commons sitting, Boris Johnson is on holiday in the Caribbean. He is reportedly flying back early from that. He has already had MPs coming out in support of him. He's got around 30, I think, publicly declared by our count, maybe slightly under. Now, the argument they make is that he has the mandate, that he won the 2019 election and he'll be able to win another election. You heard Nadine Dorries in the piece there saying that what the country needs is unity and stability and that Boris Johnson can provide that. There is an almighty question mark over whether he can really provide unity and stability though. Remember, it was 3 or 4 months ago that dozens of his own ministers were resigning, saying he was unfit to govern. He's facing an investigation by a committee of MPs into potentially misleading Parliament. There are other investigations into close allies of him that are going on that have potential to derail as well. Backbenchers say that they will potentially walk out of the party or trigger by-elections or even defect to Labour if he comes back as Prime Minister. So it's very hard to say that he is a unifier, a unity candidate here. But I think that speaks to the broader point that can anyone unify this party at the moment? Opposition parties say no, and that's why they say there should be a general election.
Well, yes, but what are the chances of that?
I think very low, because it would be Turkey's voting for Christmas situation, I think. And given one doesn't have to come for 2 years, and there's not a lot opposition parties can do to force it. Tory MPs know that given the polls how they are at the moment, they're probably better off hanging on for a couple of years and hoping things get better, rather than the near certainty of them losing many of their seats if there was to be a vote around the corner.
So complications around Boris Johnson, complications also around Rishi Sunak, because there are some in the party very loyal to Boris Johnson who feel that Rishi Sunak was disloyal to him. And then Penny Mordaunt, of course, was in the cabinet that approved that mini budget, which proved to have such a huge impact on the economy and people's mortgages.
Yeah, and I think this probably speaks to the broader point of, given the rancour that we have had, not just over the last 6 weeks, but probably over the last 6 months within the Conservative Party, are the divisions in this party so deep now that can any leader realistically bring them back together behind them? I think for Rishi Sunak, there are still those problems hanging over him. A lot of Boris Johnson loyalists still do feel aggrieved towards him. He has the upside, though, that I think he pretty much called it right in terms of his view on the economy and what could go wrong if Liz Truss made it into number 10. Interestingly, reports in the papers this morning of conversations that have been going on between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson to try and sort of patch things up, if you like. I think that division, though, on both sides is why some people point to Penny Mordaunt and say, look, maybe she can come through the middle as more of a unifier candidate. But I think there's a big question for Penny Mordaunt over whether, given that bar is set so high at 100 people, 100 MPs needed, whether she actually has the support within the parliamentary party to make it to that level.
And you mentioned the word unity. We talk about stability, the need for stability at a time when a lot of people are really worried about the cost of living crisis. Is there a chance that the potential candidates could come together and agree amongst themselves a plan of action and announce that on Monday?
I mean, potentially, but you're dealing with a lot of big egos here and a lot of people that have coveted this top job, if you like, for a very long time. I think it's interesting how the conversation has already turned. You look at some of the newspapers this morning and talk of, on the front page of the Daily Mail, of a fight for the heart of the Conservative Party, whereas 2 days ago, all the talk was about potentially a coronation, someone coming forward, and this being less a leadership battle and more just them trying to sort of continue, put someone else in place who could reassure the markets, keep Jeremy Hunt in the Treasury and potentially get the country back on an even keel again. The challenge for the Conservative Party, I think, over the next week is to try to not let this get into the sort of bloodletting that we saw over the summer. Because remember, this is set against a backdrop of people paying £100 per month more on their mortgages, potentially people's energy bills shooting up come April when some of that support is pared back as well. So I think people will be looking for the focus to be on the country rather than more Tory psychodrama.
OK, Rob, it's going to be a fascinating week ahead. Once again, how many times have I said that on a Friday? Thanks very much indeed. So let's get a view now of the developments over the last 24 hours. I'm joined now by the Conservative MP for Reigate, Crispin Blunt, who's one of the first MPs to publicly call for Liz Truss to resign. Crispin Blunt, very good morning to you. Thanks so much for talking to us. So as I say, one of the first to call for Liz Truss to go. So what's your reaction now that she's gone?
Well, honestly, I'm hugely relieved that we've got that issue out of the way, and we're now in the process of selecting a successor. I just want to spare a thought for Liz and her family. It must have been incredibly difficult. But what she hasn't yet shown is the self-knowledge through this process of having put herself forward for these responsibilities. She's made it through the process, and we've seen this rather very difficult last 6 weeks. But now we can resolve that and move on.
What do you say to those who today feel that Liz Truss has been let down? They might say that she's been subject to a coup orchestrated against someone who's just trying to do things a bit differently.
Let's just put it at its simplest. So I'm afraid it was clear, and you read the columns of people like Matthew Parris, she simply wasn't good enough to be Prime Minister. And the absence of the qualities that we could see where she was finding it very difficult to communicate effectively and the rest, all helped bring this premiership to the conclusion that it did.
So who do you think should take her place now?
My choice is now for Rishi Sunak. I have wavered in the course of the last week between Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak, but they are the two characters now who are plainly capable of being Prime Minister. Jeremy Hunt's picking up of the Chancellorship and in 3 days settling the markets and the financial position of the United Kingdom was astonishingly impressive. But as he is not going to run, then the other candidate, who is a figure who has his qualities, if not yet all of his experience, because Jeremy spent 6 years as health secretary and earlier 2 or 3 years as culture secretary. Rishi Sunak is head and shoulders, frankly, above the rest of us in terms of his basic personal capabilities of being prime minister, and that's why he would now be my choice. He was an outstanding chancellor. He brought in the furlough scheme, which, as far as I know, was globally leading and designed out of his office. This is a very, very impressive man, and I think he has the seriousness of purpose for the nation to listen and to follow him in the difficult 2 years we've got as we have to work through the consequences of COVID, the consequences of standing firmly with Ukraine, which we must. And I think he can bring not only the Conservative Party together, he can bring the nation together to address the challenge that we face.
You think he could bring the Conservative Party together, but there are a lot of people very angry with him within the Conservative Party. They think he stabbed Boris Johnson in the back. I mean, is he really someone that can pull the party together?
Well, we're going to have to work through the Johnson psychodrama. I think I was supported Boris right until the end. And I don't think we can go back there for the next 2 years. And we need to put this contest now where it sits in its, if you like, within its historic context. In 2 years' time, we're going to face the electorate. And we need to face the electorate with 2 years of restored sound administration, sound finance, and people being confident that the Conservatives can be trusted with the highest office. Boris Johnson has the most astonishing set of skills. There are one or two weaknesses kicking around in that personality, and they were fairly brutally exposed and made the subject of all the controversy that in the end led to him leaving office. He is probably not the character to restore our reputation for the next 2 years because of that controversy. However, in the future, beyond the next general election, as far as I'm concerned, the question is entirely open. But for now, we need someone who has got the proven personal capabilities of being prime minister, as well as then delivering the kind of administration which in 2 years' time the country can make a decision on, having seen the values and qualities of the Conservative Party at their best in action.
So you say he's probably not the person to come in and pull the party together, but Boris Johnson would argue he's the only one with a real mandate. He won that landslide in 2019, that big majority. He would say he's got a track record of winning elections. Would you be disappointed if he replaced Liz Truss?
I would foresee that we're going to be probably straight back in the pickle we were in when he left office. And I don't therefore think that's the right route to take. I want to escape from those problems, and I want to present my party and my government to the country in the best possible way in 2024. And I say that disinterestedly because I will not be standing in 2024. And I think these 2 years are really needed to deliver really good administration, lay the foundation for getting out of the COVID crisis, for leading Western Europe and contributing to the rest of the world, standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, with the very serious security threat that the Russians now pose to order, at least in Europe, and of course the continuing rise in China. These are the issues that have got to be addressed. And Rishi Sunak is as well placed to deal with those as Boris Johnson. He's spent enough time on the international circuit for people to have got to know him. And he will carry proper authority. And that is necessary over the next 2 years. Beyond that, let's see what happens at the 2024 general election. And for now, the Labour Party has got to address the fact that their programme was as thin as Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's in terms of detail. And that didn't survive contact with the markets and reality. And this is an opportunity for them to get their appeal to the electorate and the basis on which they're going to govern the country in 2024. They will start as odds-on favourite.
OK.
With enough detail then for them to be ready for office in 2024. This process will do favours for both sides.
OK. Crispin Blunt, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks very much indeed for giving us your views on the steps ahead. Thank you. So let's take a look then at what the morning papers have been making of it all. And the Daily Telegraph has Boris Johnson touting his credentials as the next leader, saying he claims that he could save the party from election wipeout. The Times also leads with rumours of a possible Johnson return, while the Express dares to dream, asking he couldn't, could he? The Daily Mail says a contest between Mr Johnson and his former Chancellor Rishi Sunak is a fight for the soul of the Tories. The Guardian describes the events of yesterday as the bitter end. The Metro is utterly scathing, calling Liz Truss the worst PM we've ever had. The Mirror has one simple demand: general election now. All the front pages, as you might imagine, preoccupied with what's going on here in Downing Street. Do stay with us. Still to come here on the show, I'm going to be getting reaction from Labour's Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves. We'll also take a look at the polls and see who they suggest will be the third Prime Minister in 2 months. And could Boris Johnson make a comeback? We'll speak to his former press secretary, Will Walden. Now, the chaos in Westminster isn't helping small businesses battling the cost of living against the backdrop of instability in the markets. And I believe there's some more bad news for the economy, with the latest retail sales figures worse than expected. So let's get some more detail on that. Joining me now is Sky's business correspondent, Adele Robinson. So, Adele, give us the details then. How bad is it?
Well, as you've just said there, it's worse than expected. Retail sales are down by 1.4%. That's worse than the initial prediction of 0.5%. And it continues that downward trend that we've been seeing for the last couple of months. In August, it was down by 1.6%, which was later revised to 1.7%. Now, it could have been worse actually for September, but the figures have been adjusted because of the bank holiday that was in place for the Queen's funeral, but when all shops were shut, of course. Food sales were down particularly by 1.8%, and this, of course, all once again points to that big theme, the cost of living crisis, and of course inflation, the usual suspects that we've been talking about for the last couple of months. So interest rate rises, inflation, the cost of living crisis, energy bills, and wrapped all around that is the impending recession. So there's a feeling here, particularly in Oxford from the traders we've spoken to, of a gloominess over these figures, but also over the wider economic picture. The ones that we've spoken to this week have said that they feel like they've overcome two significant hurdles in the last few years. One was the repercussions and all the nuances of Brexit for businesses. Next, it was COVID, when they saw lots of locals and communities rallying around small businesses. They thought they'd survived that. And now this, the repercussions from the mini budget, but also the wider global economic picture. The question now is what happens to the budget, which is still expected to go ahead a week on Monday, and the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility forecast, which looks at the prospects for economic growth for the country. Businesses are hoping they will still go ahead. They need to go ahead. But of course, what they're all calling for is some political stability to restore credibility. And from that, they hope that there will be some answers, that financial stability will follow.
Adele, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's take a look at some other news now. The care regulator has warned that a workforce the size of the population of Newcastle needs to be recruited urgently to ease the gridlocked health and care system. The Care Quality Commission says it's getting tougher and tougher to access care because of a massive shortage of workers. Our health correspondent Ashish Joshi reports.
Hello, Catherine.
Even at 96, living with cancer and diabetes, Catherine is still fiercely independent.
I've been not too bad, Rebecca.
But she knows eventually she will need more specialist end-of-life care in the community.
I know there's no treatment for me to have to prolong my life any longer, so will just accept what comes my way. If it can happen at the end of my life, then I don't mind. I'll tolerate it. I know my daughters will do everything possible for me to have a good ending.
500,000 people across the country can't count on the same support. They're waiting for their care to start or to be assessed. It means just under half of all patients waiting in hospitals to be discharged can't leave, even if they're medically fit.
The care sector has not always had the attention that it deserves. And this year, what we've seen is the system has gridlocked. And we're seeing when that happens, it means that people get stuck at home. It means that people come to harm.
The sector is hemorrhaging staff, just as its workforce needs to be growing to keep up with demand. Care sector leaders say the cost of living crisis has made recruitment and retention harder than ever.
We know that people are very low paid, so there's a huge concern about people leaving to join other sectors where they can earn more money, be that hospitality or retail or supermarkets.
We are monitoring closely your insulin.
Without immediate action, staff shortages in the health and care sector will increase pressure across the NHS and in the community. And that could leave people like Catherine more vulnerable this winter. Ashish Joshi, Sky News in South East London.
A New York court has dismissed a sexual assault lawsuit against Kevin Spacey. Anthony Rapp alleged the actor inappropriately touched him at a party when he was 14, which Mr. Spacey had vigorously denied. So let's get more on this now with our correspondent Shaman Freeman-Powell. And Shaman, what more can you tell us about this case then?
Well, we know that the jury had deliberated for around an hour in a court in Manhattan before finding that Anthony Rapp had not been able to prove that Kevin Spacey had made these unwanted sexual advances. Now, Rapp, who is now 50, had accused Spacey of abusing him when he was 14 years old and Spacey was 26. And Rapp had been seeking around $40 million in damages in this other case before it was dismissed. Now, we know that this was one of the many cases that came off the back of the Me Too movement, which forced the entertainment industry to address allegations of sexual abuse and harassment. And Kevin Spacey was one of the many Hollywood actors to face allegations. And as a result, Spacey's reputation as an Oscar award-winning actor had been tarnished. He was sacked from the hugely successful Netflix series House of Cards and was even forced to pay around $31 million in damages to producers because of costs that they would have incurred after firing him. Now, Spacey had categorically denied the allegations and after the lawsuit was dismissed, was reported to have hugged his lawyers before leaving the courtroom. But it isn't the last time he's likely to see the inside of a courtroom because he is separately facing around 5 allegations of sexual assault here in the UK, which he has pleaded not guilty to, and that trial is due to begin in June next year.
Shaman, thanks very much indeed. Well, also making the news this morning, a former US spy has pleaded guilty to causing the death by careless driving of Harry Dunn following a 3-year campaign for justice by the teenager's family. The 19-year-old died in 2019 after being knocked off his motorbike by Anne Sekulas outside a US base in Northamptonshire. She's been directed to attend the sentencing hearing next month. The Biden administration has accused Iran of deploying troops in Russian-occupied Crimea to help launch drone attacks on Ukraine. The UK has announced sanctions on Iranian businesses and individuals responsible for supplying the drones. Former Liverpool captain Steven Gerrard has been sacked as manager of Premier League club Aston Villa. He's been in charge less than a year and leaves the club one place above the relegation zone. Now, there have been plenty of uneasy moments for Conservative supporters over the past couple of weeks. Well, here's another one, the latest polls. Well, this shows Sky's poll of polls of voting intentions, and you can see that it crossed from a Conservative lead, that's the blue line, to a Labour one, the red line, during the Partygate scandal. But during Liz Truss's leadership, that lead has widened to some 27 points. Well, joining me now is the Head of Political and Social Research at Opinium, Adam Drummond. Very good morning to you, Adam Drummond. Thanks so much for talking to us. So the poll of polls suggesting how the gap is widening between Labour and the Conservatives at the moment. So all the more pressure on the Tories to pick a leader that might reverse that trajectory.
Exactly. And the Tories are in quite a difficult situation because Boris Johnson's approval rating when he left office in July was about 20%, so only about 4 points higher than Liz Truss's after all of the sort of carnage in the markets after the mini budget. So the difficulty they've got is that their two most well-known figures are Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, neither of whom beats Keir Starmer in a head-to-head, both of whom have got a significant amount of baggage in the eyes of voters. The only question really is whether one of them appeals more to swing voters and people who might be tempted to vote Labour, and whether the other one perhaps shores up the base a little bit more and is more popular among Conservative voters.
Are there any other candidates that would beat Keir Starmer?
It's hard to tell at the moment because one of the most unreliable questions in political polling is how would you vote if this person was the leader or if this person was prime minister? Because changing the party leader is such a big event, and it affects all of the news coverage of a party and the news cycle and everything like that. So it's really, really difficult to tell. All we can tell at the moment, as far as numbers go, are that lots of the more well-established candidates in the eyes of voters, so people who've been in the cabinet for a while, like Jeremy Hunt or previously Michael Gove, generally they do even worse than what we'll say sort of the top couple of candidates. The unknown one is Penny Mordaunt, although again the issue there is that while she may be popular among Conservative MPs, she came third in the leadership contest in the summer. She is not widely known in the public, and she is untested in terms of holding a major sort of domestic policy brief.
And there are unlikely to be any big surprises, are there? There's a high bar for the number of Conservative MPs that have to back each candidate. Each one has to have 100 backers to progress to what could be the next round. It could secure them the leadership there and then.
Exactly. I think the real question is whether or not enough Conservative MPs have swallowed the doubts that they had about Boris Johnson in the summer enough to put him through to a final round. I think based on the information we have at the moment, based on all the results that we had before the contest in the summer came down to the final two, when every poll showed Rishi Sunak losing to either Liz Truss or Penny Mordaunt or whoever else he was up against, that gives us some idea of how he might do against Penny Mordaunt. What we don't really know is how well he'd do against Boris Johnson, and whether or not enough Conservative MPs would decide to go back on the various reasons they gave for resigning from Boris Johnson's government and actually put him through to the membership.
And of course, these candidates' popularity with the public may be very different to their popularity within the Conservative Party.
That's exactly right. And Boris Johnson especially is one where you see this being the case, really. So, like I said, he left office with a 20% approval rating. Most voters who aren't sort of currently Conservative voters have quite a negative opinion of him. I think what would most likely be the case is if they went with Boris Johnson, he might shore up the base a little bit and not exactly drag the Conservatives to an election-winning position, perhaps, but sort of contain the loss, perhaps. Whereas if they choose somebody else who might have more of a chance of appealing to swing voters, maybe there was more upside there, but potentially there's also more downside.
Adam Drummond, fascinating to get your take on it all. It'll be a very interesting week ahead. Thanks very much indeed. So let's get more reaction now to the events here in Downing Street in the last 24 hours. Joining me now is the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. A very good morning to you, Rachel Reeves. Thanks so much for talking to us this morning. What do you make of the resignation of the Prime Minister? Do you welcome Liz Truss standing down?
The longer the Conservatives are in power, the less fit they are to govern. They can't just pass around being Prime Minister and being Chancellor like it's some sort of game of pass the parcel. They've done huge damage now to our economy, to our global standing in the world, and it's time for a general election to choose a government who can provide the stability and the leadership that the country desperately needs.
Well, yes, you want a general election, but it's not going to happen, is it? I mean, that's in the gift of the Prime Minister, and anyone who takes over from Liz Truss isn't going to call one.
Well, look, I know that there are a lot of decent Conservative MPs who are also incredibly worried about the state of the country, the volatility in financial markets, the damage that that is all doing to the finances of families and pensioners right across the country. And I would urge them to do the right thing and get the general election that we need, because I'm afraid just changing the person at the top, changing the person at number 10 and number 11 is not going to undo all of the damage that the Conservatives have done, not just in the last 45 days, but frankly, in the last 12 years, where we've got economic growth on the floor, interest rates and inflation extraordinary levels. And this is a crisis clearly made in Downing Street, but it is increasingly working people and some of the most vulnerable in society who are paying the price for that.
So what will you do to try to secure a general election? Will you push for a confidence vote in the new Prime Minister?
Well, we're looking at all different opportunities, but in the end, as you suggested earlier, Anna, we would have to work with Conservative MPs to be able to do that, because despite everything, they do have a majority in the House of Commons. But I know that there are a lot of Conservative MPs who share the worries of their constituents that another Conservative Prime Minister and Chancellor aren't going to be able to sort out this mess. The government has no mandate from the British people for what they're doing at the moment, no mandate for a new Prime Minister and a new Chancellor. And that is why it is so important to restore the stability that we need in our country, our ability to pay our way in the world, to get a grip of the inflation and the interest rate pressures that are out there at the moment, to secure family finances, that we cannot carry on like this. And the only way to resolve the big challenges that we have is to have a government with a mandate to provide the stability and the leadership that people are crying out for right now and are not going to get under the Conservatives.
Well, if you're relying on Tory MPs, it's very unlikely you'll manage to secure that general election. And some might say that 2 years will give the Labour Party a chance to really familiarise the public with what they stand for, what their policies are. Or are you worried that you'll lose popularity over the next 2 years before a general election?
My biggest concern right now, Anna, is what is happening in the country. People who are coming off fixed rate mortgage deals, 1.8 million of them by the end of next year, are looking to pay an extra £580 a month on average in higher mortgage payments alone. So that is why I'm saying that we need a general election. As long as it takes, Labour will continue to put the case to people, but the sooner that we can have an election, the sooner that the country can get the stability and leadership it needs.
Yes. Well, sorry to interrupt you, but you're right. We are in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and some people will say that's exactly why we don't need the uncertainty of a general election campaign.
Well, I would just say that the volatility that we've seen in the financial markets has put increased pressure on government borrowing, but it's also put increased borrowing costs on families and businesses and everybody else. I've been in Cardiff for the last 24 hours talking particularly to small businesses here about their fears for the future, with people not having the money to go to the shops, the increased energy costs that businesses are facing. People are worried sick about the future, worried sick about the cost of living, and they fear that just a new combination of Conservative Prime Minister and Chancellor, the third Conservative Prime Minister in a year, we're already on the fourth Conservative Chancellor in just 4 months. This is unprecedented, and the damage every single day that the Conservatives are doing, both to family finances, but also to our global standing in the world, it is incredibly depressing, and it is taking a toll on people's lives and people's livelihoods. The Conservatives can't just swap around who's in charge. They can't treat number 10 and number 11 Downing Street like it's some sort of short stay Airbnb. It's far too important for that. And we need a government with a mandate from the British people to make some of the difficult decisions that are needed, but to provide the leadership, the certainty and the stability that our country needs.
Well, yes, you talk about difficult decisions. I mean, realistically, Labour would have to spend the next 2 years raising taxes and cutting spending as well, wouldn't they?
Well, the reason we are talking about these difficult decisions is because of the damage that the Conservatives have done. A month ago, nobody was contemplating the need for spending reductions. That is only on the agenda now because of the spike in borrowing costs brought about by the incredibly irresponsible decisions of the Conservative Party over the last few weeks, but also
So
the
you
low
do
growth
accept that
that
Labour would have
Conservatives
to
have delivered over the
introduce
last 12
spending
years.
cuts? Sorry, Rachel
Well,
Reeves.
we've already...
You do accept then that Labour would have to go ahead with spending cuts and tax rises?
Well, the first thing that I would say to that is nobody knows, because we do not have an independent forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility. And we're in the extraordinary situation of going into a Conservative leadership contest, the second this year, and also going into a potential fiscal statement from the latest Chancellor in just over a week's time, with nobody knowing the true scale of the damage that has been done to our public finances. That's why in the House of Commons 2 days ago, Labour called for the government to publish the latest forecasts for the Office for Budget Responsibility. We know that the government have had those forecasts since Liz Truss became Prime Minister 45 or 46 days ago. We deserve to see those so that we can understand the true state of the public finances, because at the moment, nobody knows the full extent of the damage. And so it's very difficult to put forward fully funded and fully costed plans when we do not know the damage that has been done.
Any thoughts on which candidate you'd like to win and be next Prime Minister?
I want Keir Starmer to be the next Prime Minister because he's the only person who can provide the stability that the country needs. You know, the Conservatives can carry on with their pass the parcel game, but the country deserves an awful lot better than that. We deserve a general election and the chance for the people to choose who the government is.
Not what I meant, but I guess that was always the way you would answer the question. Rachel Reeves, thanks very much indeed for your time this morning.
Thank you, Anna.
So after 44 chaotic days as Prime Minister, Liz Truss has stepped down. But in what state has she left the Conservative Party? Well, her premiership was dramatic and ultimately catastrophic. So let's take a little look back. It was former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng's radical mini-budget, unveiled less than 3 weeks after her appointment, that plunged Liz Truss's leadership into chaos. His announcement of £45 billion in unfunded tax cuts sparked market turmoil and a political backlash. Then, 10 days later, came the first U-turn, Mr Kwarteng announcing the government would be abandoning the cut to the top rate of income tax. A week ago, he was sacked by the Prime Minister and replaced with Jeremy Hunt. On Monday, the new Chancellor reversed almost all of the tax measures in the mini-budget and scaled back the energy price guarantee. Then on Tuesday, a new poll revealed that Miss Truss's popularity rating had slumped to the lowest ever of any UK political leader. Another blow on Wednesday when Suella Braverman quit as Home Secretary for breaching government security rules and also hit out at the PM, expressing concern about the government's direction. By yesterday, it was all over. Following meetings with senior Tories, Liz Truss resigned. Well, Bronwyn Maddox is the former director at the Institute of Government, and she joins me now. Good morning to you, Bronwyn Maddox. What are your thoughts on this? Did the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister make the right call? Was Liz Truss right to stand down?
Yes, I don't think there was any alternative at all. She'd lost all her policies. She'd lost some of her main people already, and there was just no credibility left. So that was absolutely the right decision.
How damaged do you think the Tory party and the country has been by this episode?
The country has been rocked in its sense of confidence, and people have been left with slightly higher interest rates than that would have happened if Liz Truss had had a smoother premiership. That, yes, as she was saying, there are outside pressures that are pushing up interest rates and mortgage rates, but people have been left with higher rates because of this turmoil. There is a sort of lingering effect of that, even though her policies have been reversed. The party itself has been enormously damaged. It has shown that it can't pick a good leader and that it can't unite behind one. So it's got one more chance. Can it do that really next week? Can Tory MPs come behind one figure and try and salvage the next 2 years and put together a slate of policies that actually have some credibility.
And what do you make of the mechanism that's been laid out to choose that next leader with that big task ahead of them? They've set a pretty high bar. 100 MPs have to back each candidate for them to have a chance of going forward. What do you think that tells us about the kind of people who might go through?
It tells us that it may be Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt, and hard to see all the talk about Boris Johnson really coming to anything, I think. He might want to be the kind of vindication of people talking about him again as a possible leader, but I'd be surprised if he actually wanted it, with a real possibility that he goes on to lose at the next general election. So I think it's really down to those two. The party must be hoping, or quite a few people in it, that it's going to be just one, that it could be settled very, very quickly within days. Certainly Graham Brady, head of the committee that is running this process, has said possibly within a week they'll have a new leader. What they don't want to do is to have to go out to members again. That was the round of the contest that put Liz Truss in the front and led to all kinds of controversy about it being even less representative than you could argue that MPs are.
Well, yes, and Sir Graham Brady says that we'll get a result by next week, this Friday next week. But that would only give the new Prime Minister a matter of days to get their head around what Jeremy Hunt has planned on Monday the 31st with his fiscal statement. That's a huge task, isn't it?
Yes, it is. You'd have to assume it was someone who, the whole thing will be smoother if it's someone who agrees with what Jeremy Hunt has already indicated, which is a very conservative in the classic way budget, looking at explaining where the money is coming from, and a mixture of some tax rises probably and some spending cuts. But, what he's laid out is essentially the policies that Rishi Sunak was arguing for in the leadership campaign. So it would clearly be easiest if it all went that way. Penny Mordaunt doesn't have that kind of financial reputation, but does have a presence and a following in the party. I find it hard to think that one would bring as much stability to the general picture, but we'll have to see what the MPs pick. It is, and this is a constitutional point, it is down to the MPs, and they have one more go, in my view.
Well, yes, and presumably, sorry, finish your point.
Sorry, before if they can't pick a single candidate now, then I think it does go to a general election.
And very quickly, any new leader will want to have their own cabinet. A reshuffle then presumably means a certain amount of paralysis once again at a time when the country is going through a huge cost of living crisis.
Yes, no, that's exactly right. And the cost of living crisis isn't going to go away. And that is the main thing for any leader to tackle, as well as what's happened to Britain's standing in the world, which has been really damaged by this.
Bronwyn Maddox, really interesting to get your take. Thanks very much indeed. So what impact will the chaos at Westminster have on the so-called red wall seats in the north of England, seats taken by the Conservatives in the last general election with the promise of regeneration and levelling up? Well, Fraser Maude is in Wakefield, which Labour won back from the Tories in a by-election in June. So you no doubt have been talking to a lot of people there, Fraser. What are they saying to you?
Well, pretty quiet here at the moment, I have to say. We're in the Create Cafe. It doesn't open for another hour or so, but I can have a chat with the owner, Sean Mansey. He's been running the place here for 10 years or so. Yeah. As bad as it gets, I guess, at the moment, is it?
It is, yeah. It's the hardest period we've had since we started. The energy crisis, the shambolic government, it needs a change.
So, Liz Truss is gone. We're going to get another new Prime Minister within the next week or so. Any idea who you want it to be?
Well, we've got a choice. We either go on number 5 of the list, or we go back to Boris. What choice do we have? We need an election, don't we? Simple.
So you think that's the most sensible thing, a general election?
Yeah. I don't think this government can carry on.
Well, Liz Truss certainly can't. She's decided that she won't. Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, Penny Mordaunt, we've got a couple of names being bandied around at the moment, no one for definite. Do you think it's a step back going back to Boris, or do you think we need to look for fresh talent?
Well, it's a choice, isn't it? Like I say, we're already number 5 on the list. So, you know, going back to Boris did all right. There was a couple of indiscretions, but were they that bad? Were they that bad? Did he, you know, send the pound to plummet into an all-time low? No, the poor guy dealt with a global pandemic, a war, and God knows what else. But, you know, he dealt with a lot of things in his time, and he dealt with them well until the end. And then there was a couple of indiscretions.
I mean, we hear about this, the red wall. Wakefield's gone back to red again after people lending the Conservatives their vote. What do you think would happen at a general election? Red wall back in business again?
I would think so. Personally, I think there's 38% of the population that haven't voted in the last election, and we could have a real shock decision if everyone that hasn't voted previously votes. We could have one of the outlying parties come into force.
So what needs to happen when someone new does come in next week? What do you want them to do? What can they do to help out businesses like yours where your costs are spiralling?
I'm not sure. I'm not an economist, but I think we need to start having windfall taxes on energy companies. We need to get the energy crisis under control. That's not going to go away, but the government won't tax the energy companies because they're all in bed together in big business. So that's obviously the reason that we're not taxing them, and we'll just tax the little person on the street.
Okay, Sean, look, thanks ever so much for talking to us. I know you're going to start getting busy any time now. Let you get back in the kitchen there. So that's the word from here in Wakefield. Sean definitely thinks that a general election is the only way forward. We need some stability. We need some economic certainty, which has been pretty scarce for the past few months.
Indeed. Fraser, thanks very much indeed for that. Well, let's get another view now. Joining me is the former press secretary to Boris Johnson and current managing director of public affairs at Edelman UK, Will Walden. Good morning to you, Will Walden. Nice to talk to you. First of all,
hello, Anna.
Liz Truss, did she have to go?
Yeah, she absolutely did. I mean, essentially none of her policies were left. Her obsession with small state Britain, tanked the economy, essentially, and there was no way back. And once she had replaced her Chancellor with Jeremy Hunt and he ditched all her policies, there was only one way, and that was out the door. I mean, I think there probably will be very little sympathy for Liz Truss among the public this morning. Polls suggest that just 2% think she did a good job. But from a personal point of view, it's an absolute tragedy and it's a humiliation. And she will have to live with the fact now that her place in history as the shortest serving Prime Minister should essentially be the answer to a pub quiz question. And that must be terrible for her personally. But, the country couldn't carry on as it is and we needed a change. The problem is that I don't think there's any clarity about what that change will look like.
Well, yes, and what's your take, given that you work closely with Boris Johnson? Do you think he will try to run again?
Everyone's saying, Johnson's in the frame, he's flying back. I've spoken to someone that's spoken to him and he is on the way back and clearly he's taking soundings. But the thing about Boris is that he absolutely hates to lose. And I suspect that if he doesn't think he can get to the 100, or more importantly, he can come second in this in the first vote, because I think, Rishi Sunak is clearly the front runner, then he won't run. But if he does think he can, then I'm sure he will, because, in his mind, he's done nothing wrong. He's been unfairly defenestrated. Whether you think that's true or not, it doesn't matter to Boris. And it's not a case of the national interest, it's a case of Boris's interest. So if he thinks that he has a chance of winning with the members' vote next week, then he'll run. I think the problem with that is that, the Tory party doesn't have a unity candidate, and they seem to have, those that are backing him already seem to have forgotten very quickly what's happened. Boris at his best had an elastic relationship with the truth, but if you add everything that happened, Patterson and parties and Pincher and the way he governed and the fact that, before he left, there were 2 horrific by-election defeats, in a way that the behoving of Liz Truss to the country was Boris Johnson's responsibility. And I think, we are all guilty of collective amnesia if we forget that 6 weeks ago, 70% of the country consistently wanted him out, including a majority of Tory voters. And there's no evidence that they've changed their mind. There's also no evidence that Boris has changed his mind in terms of how he'll behave or how he'll govern. I think the problem for the Tory party at the moment is that there isn't necessarily a unity candidate. I was on another broadcaster earlier, Anna, and I suggested that there was some unanimity amongst perhaps a small majority of Tory backbenchers that Rishi Sunak, was the front runner and could be a unity candidate. And a very senior member of the government texted me and said that's rubbish. He's almost as unpopular among many as Boris Johnson. So there is no easy choice. I think if there was a unity candidate, it would be somebody like the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. I think there's two problems there. I get the sense that Ben Wallace won't run. And the other thing is that the country doesn't know what a Ben Wallace platform would look like. So I think it's a horrific mess, and I think they've got a week to get it right, and I'm not sure they're necessarily going to.
And is there actually such a thing as a unity candidate when you've got a party that's so divided?
Yeah, and I think that's the problem, is that, are they thinking in the best interest of the Conservative Party or the best interest of the country? And the problem is that the Conservative Party is now so riven, not just with factions, but just with a sense of identity. What does it actually stand for? And the truth is, the idea that we're suddenly going to find that out in only a week from somebody, I think is laughable. So I think that there is clearly a sense among the sort of governing or managing hierarchy in the Conservative Party, talking to some of them, that what they really need is for, this contest to have a clear front runner, and then whoever comes second, assuming it isn't Boris Johnson, to fold in behind that person. I think the trouble is that's a huge ask, and we don't know, who that person who might come second, whether they would want to fold in. Anyone that comes second in this contest presumably thinks they have a chance of winning. Why would they do that? And that's partly a problem with the system of electing the next leader. It's also partly a problem with the fact that the Tory party has lost its identity. And that's why I think that, unfortunately, the likely outcome is that whoever they choose, that unity will dissipate fairly quickly, and I suspect we'll end up with a general election in pretty short order.
Well, Will Walden, always fascinating to get your take. Thanks very much indeed for your time this morning. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks, Anna. Take care.